The pewter spoon trembled in Evelyn's calloused fingers as she stirred death into the evening stew. Outside the cabin windows, two rival clans sat shoulder to shoulder around makeshift tables, their rifles propped against oak trees like sleeping sentries. This is the story of how one woman's desperate act of vengeance would transform a fragile peace into the bloodiest family feud in Appalachian history. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're ready for a deep dive into one of America's most shocking acts of rebellion, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories. Clay County, Kentucky, September 15th, 1857. The air hung thick with wood smoke and unspoken threats as the Mackenzie and Hatfield clans gathered for their first shared meal in 3 generations. Evelyn watched through the kitchen doorway as bearded patriarchs who'd spent decades trying to kill each other now passed cornbread with trembling, weathered hands. The truce had been necessity, not choice. Federal marshals had descended on the county like locusts after the previous spring's massacre at Timber Creek, 7 dead, including 2 children caught in crossfire. Judge Samuel Morrison had been clear: make peace or face the gallows. Both families had too much blood on their hands to risk federal justice. Evelyn's bare feet moved soundlessly across the rough-hewn floorboards as she prepared what would become known as the Last Supper of Clay County. Her master, Jeremiah Mackenzie, had purchased her from a tobacco plantation near Louisville just 6 months prior, specifically for her reputation as a cook. What he didn't know was that her previous master had died under mysterious circumstances after dismissing her younger brother to settle a gambling debt. The kitchen blazed with heat from the massive stone hearth. Cast iron pots bubbled with venison stew, their surfaces reflecting the dancing flames like black mirrors. Evelyn had spent 3 days preparing this feast. Cornbread with real butter, green beans seasoned with fatback, sweet potato pie that would make angels weep. Everything perfect. Everything except for one crucial ingredient that no recipe would ever record. She moved with practiced efficiency, her dark skin glistening with perspiration, her calico dress clinging to her slight frame. At 19, Evelyn possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that made white folks nervous, the ability to listen, remember, and plan. Tonight, that intelligence would serve a purpose darker than any master could imagine. The deadly addition came from a small leather pouch she'd kept hidden beneath loose floorboards since her arrival. Oleander root, dried and ground to powder, a poison so potent that mountain folk called it widow's dust. She'd learned its secrets from her grandmother, a woman who'd survived 3 different plantations, by knowing which plants healed and which plants killed. Through the window, she could see Jeremiah Mackenzie raising his tin cup in a toast. His face, normally twisted with suspicion and rage, had softened into something almost resembling hope. Beside him sat Thomas Hatfield, the enemy patriarch, his own cup lifted high. Children from both families, some barely old enough to walk, played between the tables, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. For just a moment, Evelyn's resolve wavered. Then she remembered her brother Samuel's screams as the slave catchers dragged him away. Remembered Jeremiah's casual dismissal when she'd begged for information about where they'd taken him. Property don't get to ask questions, gal. The oleander powder dissolved completely into the stew, invisible as original sin. Historical records from the Clay County Courthouse would later reveal that 17 people sat down for that feast of reconciliation, men who'd spent their adult lives nursing grudges that stretched back to disputed land claims and stolen horses, women who'd buried children killed in senseless raids, young couples who dared to dream of a future without the shadow of inherited hatred. Evelyn ladled the poisoned stew into wooden bowls, her movements mechanical, her face a mask of servile obedience. Each portion contained enough oleander to kill a grown man within the hour. She carried the bowls outside on wooden trays, setting them before her targets with steady hands. Smells like heaven itself, declared Thomas Hatfield, inhaling deeply. The irony would not be lost on later chroniclers of this tragedy. As darkness crept across the Kentucky hills, oil lamps flickered to life around the gathering. Conversation flowed more freely than it had in decades, lubricated by corn whiskey and the intoxicating possibility of peace. Stories were shared. Old grievances, for perhaps the first time, were acknowledged rather than inflamed. Evelyn retreated to the shadows beyond the lamplight, watching as spoons clinked against bowls. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. There would be no turning back from this moment, no explanation that would save her from the rope or the fire. But freedom, she'd learned, sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice. The first man to show symptoms would be Isaiah Mackenzie, Jeremiah's eldest son. His complaint of stomach cramps would be dismissed as too much whiskey on an empty stomach. Within minutes, that assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. But what happened next would transform this act of personal vengeance into something far more sinister and far more devastating than even Evelyn could have imagined. The question that would haunt Clay County for generations wasn't just how she did it, but why the federal marshals never came looking for answers. Isaiah Mackenzie's face turned the color of ash as he doubled over his wooden bowl, retching violently onto the packed earth below the feast table. What began as one man's sudden illness would, within the next 27 minutes, become a massacre that would make the previous spring's bloodshed look like a church social. The first sign of trouble came at 8:43 that evening, just as Thomas Hatfield was recounting the story of his grandfather's first encounter with a Mackenzie over disputed creek rights. Isaiah's violent convulsions shattered the convivial atmosphere like a stone through glass. His younger brother Marcus leaped up, knocking over his own bowl as he rushed to help. "Too much shine, boy," Jeremiah Mackenzie laughed, though his eyes betrayed growing concern. "Can't hold his liquor like his daddy." But laughter died in Jeremiah's throat as his daughter Mary began exhibiting the same symptoms, violent stomach cramps, followed by projectile vomiting that splattered across the makeshift tables. Then came little Benjamin Hatfield, barely 12 years old, collapsing from his stool with foam bubbling from his lips. Evelyn pressed herself deeper into the shadows beyond the oil lamp's glow, watching her plan unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. The oleander was working faster than she'd anticipated. Her grandmother had warned her that the mountain variety was more potent than the lowland species concentrated by harsh winters and rocky soil into something approaching pure malevolence. Within minutes, the peaceful gathering had transformed into a scene from Dante's darkest imaginings. Men and women who moments before had been sharing stories now writhed in agony, their bodies betraying them in the most humiliating ways possible. The stench of vomit and human waste, mixed with wood smoke and the lingering aroma of what had been, until recently, a magnificent feast. Dr. Ezekiel Morgan, the only physician within 50 miles, wouldn't arrive until nearly midnight, summoned by a child who'd run 6 miles through mountain trails in complete darkness. By then, his services would be needed not for healing, but for determining cause of death. The first to die was young Benjamin Hatfield. His small body simply couldn't process the amount of poison Evelyn had ladled into his bowl, the same portion size she'd given the adults. His father Thomas held him as convulsions racked the child's frame, Benjamin's eyes rolling back until only white showed. At 9:17, the boy's breathing stopped entirely. Thomas Hatfield's anguished howl echoed off the surrounding hills like the cry of a wounded animal. My boy is dead." The accusation came swift and inevitable. "Mackenzie treachery!" Thomas roared, his grief instantly transmuting into rage. "This was planned. This whole piece was a trap." Jeremiah Mackenzie, despite his own obvious suffering from the poison, managed to stand on unsteady legs. His face had taken on the waxy pallor of impending death, but his voice still carried the authority of a man accustomed to violence. "You lying bastard, half my own family is dying. Look at my Isaiah." Indeed, Isaiah Mackenzie had progressed beyond vomiting into full convulsions, his body arching backward in impossible angles as the oleander attacked his nervous system. His wife Rebecca knelt beside him, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to hold his thrashing form still. But suspicion, once planted, grew like wildfire through dry brush. Sarah Hatfield, Thomas's eldest daughter, pointed an accusing finger at the surviving Mackenzies. "The women," she shrieked. "Look, the Mackenzie women ain't sick. They knew. They all knew." It was true. Through either coincidence or divine intervention, 3 Mackenzie wives had barely touched their stew, having spent most of the evening tending to the children and ensuring everyone else was well fed. Now their survival marked them as conspirators in the eyes of the dying Hatfields. Evelyn watched the tragedy compound itself with each passing moment. Her act of personal vengeance was mutating into something far beyond her control or intention. The families weren't just dying, they were dying convinced of each other's treachery. Marcus Mackenzie, despite his own obvious illness, managed to draw his pistol with a trembling hand. "Nobody accuses my family of poison without proof." The weapon's appearance transformed chaos into potential massacre. Other men, despite their weakening conditions, began reaching for guns that had been left respectfully distant during the peace feast. The truce that had taken federal intervention to arrange was dissolving in real time, poisoned as thoroughly as the evening's meal. Dr. Morgan's later testimony to federal authorities would note that the symptoms matched several known plant toxins common to the Kentucky mountains. However, his investigation would be hampered by a crucial factor. By the time he arrived, evidence of the poisoning had been scattered or destroyed in the chaos that followed. At 9:36, Mary Mackenzie died in her mother's arms. Her last words, a whispered question, "Mama, why does it hurt so bad?" Her death triggered the evening's final transformation from tragedy to warfare. Jeremiah Mackenzie, with his daughter's blood still wet on his hands, raised his own weapon toward Thomas Hatfield. "You killed her. Somehow, you killed my little girl." The gunshot that followed would echo through Clay County for the next 37 years. But the most chilling detail of that night wouldn't emerge until decades later, discovered in the private journals of a circuit preacher who'd been traveling through the county. According to his account, someone had been systematically removing evidence from the scene, even as people lay dying, someone who knew exactly what to look for and where to find it. The question that would haunt investigators wasn't just who had committed this act of mass murder, but who had been covering their tracks, even as the bodies were still warm. The muzzle flash split the darkness like lightning, and Thomas Hatfield crumpled beside his dead son's body, crimson spreading across his white cotton shirt. This single shot would ignite a blood feud that would consume 3 generations and leave Clay County's hills littered with unmarked graves. Jeremiah Mackenzie's smoking pistol wavered in his grip as the oleander poison continued its relentless assault on his nervous system. Around the feast tables, the surviving members of both clans scrambled for weapons, despite their deteriorating conditions, some crawling on hands and knees toward rifles that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. Evelyn pressed her back against the rough bark of an oak tree, her heart hammering as she watched her carefully planned revenge spiral into pure chaos. She'd intended to eliminate the Mackenzie family and escape in the confusion. She hadn't counted on the Hatfields being equally convinced of Mackenzie treachery, nor had she anticipated how quickly dying men could transform grief into violence. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of death and human waste as more shots rang out across the clearing. Rebecca Mackenzie, still cradling her convulsing husband Isaiah, screamed as a Hatfield bullet splintered the wooden table inches from her head. The children who'd been playing between the tables just an hour earlier now cowered behind overturned benches, their innocent laughter replaced by terrified sobs. Sarah Hatfield managed to reach her father's rifle, despite the violent cramping that doubled her over every few steps. Her hands shook, whether from poison or rage. It was impossible to tell as she raised the weapon toward the Mackenzie women. "Murderers!" she shrieked. "You killed my baby brother." But before she could fire, another convulsion seized her. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the night sky as Sarah collapsed, foam bubbling from her lips, just as it had with young Benjamin. The oleander was claiming its victims with ruthless efficiency, making no distinction between guilty and innocent, young and old. According to a dispatch found decades later in the Kentucky State Archives, circuit preacher Jonathan Whitmore had been traveling the mountain roads that night, seeking shelter for himself and his horse. His private journal, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1923, contained details that no official investigation had ever recorded. Whitmore wrote, "Heard the gunfire from near a mile off. Thought it might be celebration, as mountain folk are known to discharge weapons in joy. Drew closer and smelled death, a stench no man of God should have to recognize so readily. Saw a figure moving among the dying, collecting something from beneath the tables. Could not tell if it was man or woman as they kept to shadows, but their purpose seemed most deliberate. That mysterious figure was removing every trace of the oleander powder that might have spilled during Evelyn's preparation. While families destroyed each other in their final moments, someone was ensuring that the true cause of this massacre would remain hidden." The gunfight itself lasted only 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes claimed 4 more lives. Marcus Mackenzie took a Hatfield bullet through the chest and died instantly. 2 Hatfield cousins, James and William, were cut down when they charged the Mackenzie position despite being barely able to stand. Old Martha Mackenzie, Jeremiah's wife of 30 years, caught a stray shot that shattered her skull as she tried to drag her dying daughter to safety. By 10:15 that evening, silence had fallen over the clearing. Not the peaceful quiet of reconciliation they'd hoped for, but the terrible stillness that follows wholesale slaughter. 11 people lay dead from poison, 4 more from gunshot wounds. Only 2 survivors remained conscious. Young Samuel Hatfield, who'd been too nervous to eat much of the stew, and Evelyn herself, still hidden in the darkness beyond the lamplight. Samuel Hatfield stumbled among the bodies like a man in a nightmare, his 16-year-old mind struggling to process the carnage surrounding him. Both his father and younger brother were dead. His sister Sarah's body lay twisted beside an overturned bench, her eyes staring sightlessly at the stars. The peace feast that was supposed to end generations of bloodshed had become the worst massacre in the feud's history. But the most disturbing discovery came when Samuel began searching for survivors among the Mackenzie side. Every bowl, every spoon, every trace of the evening's meal had vanished. The wooden tables that should have been covered with remnants of poisoned stew were clean. Not just clean, but scrubbed so thoroughly that they gleamed in the lamplight. Someone had methodically erased all evidence of how this tragedy had truly begun. Evelyn watched from her hiding place as young Samuel Hatfield discovered this impossible cleanliness. His confusion was evident even from a distance. How could 15 people die from poisoned food when no trace of that food remained? The boy's bewilderment would soon transform into something far more dangerous. The absolute certainty that the Mackenzie family had orchestrated this massacre with premeditation and military precision. When Dr. Morgan finally arrived at 11:57, his medical examination would find symptoms consistent with plant poisoning. But without physical evidence of the toxin, and with the only coherent witness convinced of Mackenzie treachery, his official report would focus on the gunshot wounds rather than their underlying cause. The truth about Evelyn's oleander would die with its victims, but Samuel Hatfield's survival guaranteed that the story of this night would live on and grow with each telling. Within days, his account of Mackenzie betrayal and mass murder would spread through the Kentucky mountains like wildfire. The boy's testimony would transform a slave woman's act of personal vengeance into the founding myth of the deadliest family feud in American history. What Samuel didn't know, as he stumbled through the corpse-strewn clearing that night, was that someone was still watching him from the shadows. Someone who now realized that her own survival depended on ensuring his version of events became the accepted truth. Evelyn's bare feet found purchase on the dew-slicked rocks as she fled through the mountain darkness, the screams of dying men still echoing in her ears like a chorus from hell. Her desperate flight that night would not only ensure her survival, but transform her from perpetrator into ghost, a shadow that would haunt Clay County for decades without anyone ever knowing her name. The girl moved with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent her life avoiding attention. Behind her, the clearing still glowed with the flickering light of overturned oil lamps, casting dancing shadows across the corpse-strewn ground. She'd waited in the oak tree's shadow until young Samuel Hatfield finally collapsed from exhaustion and grief, then slipped away like smoke on the mountain breeze. Her calico dress caught on brambles as she navigated the treacherous path toward Timber Creek, the same waterway where the previous spring's massacre had claimed 7 lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was following the route that countless others had used to flee the violence of this endless feud. But unlike those who'd run from the bullets of their enemies, Evelyn was running from the consequences of her own terrible justice. The leather pouch that had held the oleander powder now lay at the bottom of Mackenzie's well, weighted down with stones and wrapped in oilcloth. She dropped it there during the chaos of the gunfight, when everyone's attention was focused on the dying and the dead. It would remain hidden for the next 67 years, until drought forced the county to dig new wells and revealed secrets that had been buried in darkness. Dawn found Evelyn 20 miles south, huddled beneath a limestone overhang that local slaves used as a way station on the Underground Railroad. Her hands still trembled, not from the cold mountain air, but from the magnitude of what she'd unleashed. 15 people were dead by her hand, and the fragile peace between the families had been shattered beyond any hope of repair. But news traveled fast in the Kentucky mountains, especially news of violence. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridges, writers were already spreading Samuel Hatfield's version of events to every hollow and settlement within 50 miles. According to the boy's fevered account, the Mackenzie family had orchestrated the most elaborate act of treachery in the feud's bloody history. The story that emerged bore only passing resemblance to reality. In Samuel's telling, Jeremiah Mackenzie had invited the Hatfields to a peace feast while secretly planning their wholesale murder. The poison had been administered by Mackenzie women who'd pretended to eat while actually avoiding their own deadly concoction. The cleanup of evidence proved premeditation on a scale that suggested Mackenzie connections reaching all the way to Louisville or beyond. Circuit rider-preacher Moses Caldwell recorded the evolving narrative in his journal as he traveled from settlement to settlement that week. October 21st. Heard tell of the Clay County massacre from 3 different sources today. Each account grows more elaborate than the last. Young Hatfield boy's story of Mackenzie treachery has taken on biblical proportions. Some now claim the poison came from as far away as New Orleans, brought by Mackenzie agents who'd been planning this massacre for months. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these tales. A 19-year-old slave girl had poisoned a stew pot in an act of personal revenge, and the chaos that followed had been seized upon by someone else. Someone who understood that the real story of Evelyn's oleander was far less useful than the myth of Mackenzie betrayal. That mysterious figure who'd cleaned the evidence while people lay dying remained a puzzle that would never be solved. Preacher Whitmore's journal described them as moving with purpose and familiarity, suggesting intimate knowledge of what had occurred. But their identity and their motives for covering Evelyn's tracks would remain one of Clay County's deepest secrets. By November, the story had reached newspaper editors as far away as Cincinnati and Charleston. The Louisville Courier ran a front-page account under the headline, "Mountain Massacre. Kentucky Clan War Reaches New Depths of Depravity." The article described the Mackenzie family as calculating murderers who violated every law of hospitality and Christian decency and called for federal intervention to prevent further bloodshed. What the newspapers didn't report couldn't report, because no one knew, was that the surviving Hatfield clan was already organizing its response. Samuel Hatfield, despite his youth, had been proclaimed the new family patriarch following his father's death. His first official act was to place a blood bounty on every surviving Mackenzie. $500 for Jeremiah's surviving brothers, $300 for their wives, $100 even for the children. The bounty notices, handwritten on brown paper and nailed to trees throughout the county, contained a phrase that would become the Hatfield battle cry for the next 3 decades. Death to all Mackenzie spawn, for Thomas and Benjamin's blood cries out from the ground. Meanwhile, Evelyn had disappeared into the network of safe houses and hidden routes that moved escaped slaves toward freedom in Ohio. Her trail went cold somewhere near the Kentucky-Indiana border. Though rumors of a young black woman with unusual knowledge of mountain plants would surface periodically in abolitionist circles throughout the 1860s, she would never know that her act of vengeance had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a founding myth that would justify decades of murder and mayhem between families who'd forgotten why they'd started killing each other in the first place. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the question that no one in Clay County dared ask. If the Mackenzies had truly orchestrated this massacre with such elaborate premeditation, why had so many of them died eating their own poison? The logical inconsistency at the heart of Samuel Hatfield's story should have raised immediate questions. Instead, it became Holy Writ, the gospel truth that would drive 3 generations of mountaineers to kill each other with religious fervor. Sometimes, the most dangerous lies are the ones people desperately want to believe. The first revenge killing came exactly 13 days after the poison feast, when 17-year-old Jacob Mackenzie was found hanging from the old hanging tree at Miller's Crossroads, his body riddled with shotgun pellets. This brutal execution would establish the template for a cycle of vengeance that would claim 137 lives over the next 4 decades, each death justified by the lie that Evelyn had unwittingly created. The boy's murder bore all the hallmarks of Hatfield justice: methodical, public, and designed to send an unmistakable message. Jacob had been captured while checking his rabbit traps near Stillwater Creek, bound with hemp rope, and forced to march the 6 miles to the crossroads where both families had traditionally settled their grievances. The shotgun blasts came only after he'd been strung up, ensuring maximum suffering before death. Pinned to Jacob's chest was a note scrawled in Samuel Hatfield's distinctive hand. 1 Mackenzie devil sent to hell, 13 more to follow for the crime of poison murder. The number was precise. Samuel had counted every surviving member of his enemy's bloodline, including distant cousins and in-laws who'd never set foot in Clay County. News of the hanging reached the remaining Mackenzies within hours, carried by a traveling tinker who discovered the body at dawn. The reaction was swift and devastating. By sunset, 3 Hatfield cousins lay dead in Possum Hollow, their throats cut with such violence that their heads were nearly severed. This time, the Mackenzie response was signed with their traditional calling card, a playing card, the ace of spades nailed through each victim's forehead. Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived in Clay County on November 15, 1857, carrying orders from Washington to restore order before the violence spread to neighboring counties. His official report, filed 3 weeks later, would become one of the most disturbing documents in the National Archives, not for what it revealed, but for what it carefully omitted. Hayes interviewed Samuel Hatfield for over 6 hours, recording the young man's account of the Poison Feast massacre in meticulous detail. The marshal's notes describe Samuel as coherent and consistent in his testimony, showing no signs of deception or mental instability. What Hayes didn't record, though it appeared in his private correspondence, was his growing certainty that Samuel's story, while sincerely believed, contained impossible elements that suggested either mass hallucination or deliberate deception. The most troubling inconsistency involved the cleanup of evidence. According to Samuel's account, The Mackenzie women had systematically removed all traces of the poisoned food, while their own family members lay dying around them. Hayes noted in his private journal, "Such coldness would require either inhuman calculation or complete foreknowledge. Yet 3 Mackenzie women died that night, and 2 others showed clear signs of poisoning." No rational person would consume poison to maintain a deception, but rationality had fled Clay County along with any hope of peaceful resolution. The marshal's attempts to interview Mackenzie survivors were hampered by their understandable reluctance to emerge from hiding. When he finally located Jeremiah's brother Ezekiel, the man's first words were, "Marshal, they killed my nephew Jacob like a dog, strung him up, and filled him full of shot. You tell me how federal law accounts for that." The cycle of retribution was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control. By Christmas of 1857, the death toll had reached 23, with casualties mounting so rapidly that local churches couldn't dig graves fast enough. Reverend Silas Compton wrote to his bishop in Louisville, "The county has gone mad with bloodlust. Families who once shared pews now shoot each other on sight. I fear we are witnessing the birth of something unholy, a hatred so pure it will outlive us all." What made the violence particularly devastating was its precision. This wasn't the random brutality of desperadoes or the chaotic killing of wartime. Both families maintained detailed records of their enemies, tracking bloodlines with the thoroughness of genealogical scholars. Every death was calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining the mathematical precision of blood debt. The Hatfields developed a particularly chilling innovation. They began targeting Mackenzie women who were pregnant, ensuring that future generations of their enemies would never be born. The Mackenzies responded by adopting the practice of killing entire Hatfield households, including children and elderly grandparents, to eliminate any possibility of future revenge seekers. By spring of 1858, the violence had spread beyond the original families to encompass their allies, business partners, and anyone unlucky enough to share their surnames. Merchants refused to enter Clay County. Circuit judges postponed court sessions indefinitely. The Federal Postal Service suspended mail delivery after 3 mail carriers were found dead on mountain trails, their bags rifled through in search of intelligence about enemy movements. Yet through all this escalating horror, the original lie remained unexamined. Samuel Hatfield's account of Mackenzie treachery had become religious dogma, repeated with such conviction that questioning it was tantamount to heresy. New recruits to the Hatfield cause were required to swear a blood oath over the graves of Thomas and Benjamin, promising to avenge the poison murder that started this righteous war. The truth about Evelyn's oleander was buried deeper with each telling of the tale. She had become a ghost twice over, first by disappearing into the Underground Railroad, and second by being erased from the very story her actions had created. But ghosts have a way of returning when least expected. In the summer of 1894, 37 years after the poison feast, a discovery in the ruins of the old Mackenzie homestead would finally reveal the truth about that night and prove that the deadliest family feud in American history had been built on a foundation of lies. The rusted leather pouch emerged from the Mackenzie well, like a condemned man's confession, its oilcloth wrapping still intact after 37 years in the darkness below. This single discovery would finally reveal the truth about the Clay County massacre, but the revelation would come too late to save the 137 souls who died believing a lie. The drought of 1894 had been the worst in Kentucky's recorded history. Streams that had flowed since before white settlement ran bone dry. Ancient oak trees withered and died. Even the deepest wells began to fail, forcing desperate farmers to dig ever deeper in search of water that seemed to have vanished from the earth itself. Luther Bradshaw, the new county water commissioner, had been tasked with surveying all existing wells to determine which ones might be expanded or deepened. The old Mackenzie homestead had stood empty since 1873, when the last surviving family member, Jeremiah's nephew David, had been shot dead while tending his tobacco crop. But the well remained, and Luther's drought survey required him to examine every source of water in the county. What he found at the bottom of that 30-foot shaft would change everything. The pouch had been weighted with stones and wrapped so carefully in oilcloth that its contents remained perfectly preserved. Inside, Luther discovered not just the remnants of ground oleander root, but something far more damning. A letter written in careful script, detailing exactly how much poison to use, and warning about the speed with which mountain oleander could kill. The letter was signed, "Your loving grandmother, Celia." But even more shocking than the physical evidence was the diary Luther found hidden beneath loose floorboards in the abandoned cabin. Written in the same careful hand as the poison recipe, it documented every detail of the massacre from an impossible perspective, that of someone who had been present throughout the entire tragedy, yet whose existence had never been recorded in any official account. The diary belonged to Evelyn. Her entries, dated from June through September of 1857, told the true story of the poison feast with devastating clarity. She described her brother Samuel's sale to settle Jeremiah Mackenzie's gambling debt, her careful preparation of the oleander powder, her decision to poison the entire gathering, rather than risk exposure by targeting only the Mackenzie family. Most chilling of all, she documented her growing horror as she realized the scale of violence her act would unleash. One entry, dated September 20th, read, "The Hatfields believe the Mackenzies planned this as treachery. They will never stop killing now. I have made monsters of them all. God forgive me. I have made monsters of them all." Luther Bradshaw faced an impossible choice. The truth about Evelyn's crime could finally end the blood feud that had devastated Clay County for nearly 4 decades. But revealing that truth would also prove that every Hatfield who died in righteous vengeance had actually died for a lie. Every widow who'd buried her husband believing in Mackenzie treachery, every child who'd grown up swearing to avenge their father's murder. The water commissioner made his decision on August 15, 1894, exactly 37 years after young Benjamin Hatfield had died with foam on his lips. He burned the diary page by page in his kitchen fireplace, watching Evelyn's words transform into ash and smoke. The letter from her grandmother followed, its deadly recipe disappearing into flames that reflected off Luther's tears. Only the empty leather pouch remained, and that he buried beneath his own cabin, wrapped in a new layer of oilcloth that would keep the secret safe for another generation. His decision was motivated by more than just kindness to the grieving families. By 1894, only a handful of original participants in the feud remained alive. Samuel Hatfield, now 53 and scarred by decades of violence, had buried 4 of his own sons in the name of avenging his father and brother. The elderly man had spent his entire adult life in service to a lie, building monuments to false martyrs, and teaching his children to hate for reasons that had never existed. Luther's private journal, discovered decades later during his estate sale, revealed the depth of his moral struggle. What good would truth serve now? Samuel Hatfield is a broken man who has lost everything to this feud. His sons, his brothers, his peace all sacrificed to avenge a crime that never happened, as he believed. Would knowledge of his error heal his wounds or multiply them beyond endurance? The violence was already winding down by the 1890s. Federal intervention had grown more aggressive, and the younger generation of both families was growing tired of inheriting their father's hatreds. Railroad development was bringing new opportunities to Clay County, and many survivors were choosing prosperity over vengeance. But the myth of the poison feast remained central to both families' identities. Hatfield children still learn the story of Mackenzie treachery as their first lesson in family history. Mackenzie descendants, scattered across half a dozen states, still gathered annually to honor their martyred ancestors who died at the hands of Hatfield murderers. Luther Bradshaw's suppression of the evidence meant that these myths would survive unchanged, passed down through generations like sacred scripture. Evelyn's true story would remain buried not just in a well, but in the collective unconscious of a county that had built its identity on a lie. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. A slave girl's act of desperate vengeance had been transformed into a noble tale of martyrdom for both sides. The Hatfields believed they were avenging innocent victims of Mackenzie poison. The Mackenzies believed they were defending themselves against Hatfield aggression. Both families had constructed elaborate justifications for their violence, and both were completely wrong. As Luther watched the last pages of Evelyn's diary crackle and burn, he couldn't have known that he was making a decision that would echo through American history. The Clay County feud would become legendary, inspiring novels, ballads, and eventually Hollywood films. Tourists would visit the sites of famous battles. Historians would write doctoral dissertations analyzing the socio-economic factors that had driven the violence, all of them building their theories on a foundation of lies that one water commissioner had chosen to preserve rather than destroy. But secrets have their own momentum, and some truths refuse to stay buried forever. The question that would haunt Clay County wasn't whether Evelyn's story would eventually surface, but when and what price the living would pay for the sins of the dead. The truth about Evelyn finally surfaced in 1963 when construction crews expanding Interstate 75 unearthed the cast iron box buried beneath Luther Bradshaw's former cabin. This final revelation would prove that even the most carefully buried secrets eventually claw their way back to the surface, carrying with them the weight of every lie told in their name. The construction foreman, a man named Robert Hensley, whose great-grandfather had died in the feud, initially thought the box contained Civil War artifacts. Kentucky hills were littered with such discoveries: rusted buttons, old bullets, fragments of equipment left behind by armies that had marched through these mountains a century before. But when the box was opened in the presence of state archaeologists, its contents told a story far stranger than any military campaign. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived nearly 70 years underground, lay Luther Bradshaw's complete correspondence regarding the Clay County feud, letters to and from federal marshals, copies of witness statements that had never been filed with official reports. Most damning of all, a detailed confession written in Luther's own hand, explaining why he'd chosen to suppress the evidence of Evelyn's crime. The confession, dated December 31st, 1899, read like the testament of a man whose conscience could no longer bear the weight of his silence. I have carried this burden for 5 years now, watching families honor the memory of a massacre that never happened as they believe. Every grave marker, every anniversary memorial, every child taught to hate, all built upon foundations I knew to be false. Yet what greater cruelty would truth serve now? The dead cannot be returned to life, and the living have found what peace they can in their myths. But the most shocking discovery came in a separate envelope, marked in Luther's careful script. For the descendants of Evelyn, should they seek to understand their ancestors' burden. Inside was a complete transcript of her diary, copied by Luther before he'd burned the original, along with a map showing where he'd reburied her leather pouch and the remaining oleander powder. The archaeological team followed Luther's map to a spot beneath what had once been the Mackenzie cabin's kitchen hearth. There, exactly where his notes indicated, they found Evelyn's pouch, along with something even more remarkable: a second diary, apparently written by someone else who'd been present that night, but whose identity had remained hidden for over a century. This second journal belonged to Moses, an elderly slave who'd worked as the Mackenzie family's groundskeeper and general laborer. His entries revealed that he'd been the mysterious figure Preacher Whitmore had observed cleaning evidence while people lay dying. But Moses hadn't been covering up the crime he'd been trying to protect Evelyn, whom he'd recognized as his own granddaughter, sold away from their family plantation when she was barely 12 years old. Moses's final entry, dated September 16th, 1857, provided the last piece of the puzzle. Evelyn has fled toward the river crossing. I pray she finds the Freedom Road and makes it to Canada. She was a child when they stole her from us, and the anger she carried was righteous, even if its fruits were bitter. I cleaned what traces I could find so they would not hunt her with dogs. Let the families kill each other for their own sins, not for the justice of a slave girl whose only crime was loving her brother. The revelation of Evelyn's true story sent shockwaves through the communities that had built their identities around the feud. Descendants of both families, now scattered across the country, but still connected by shared mythology, struggled to process the implications. Family reunions became exercises in cognitive dissonance, as people tried to reconcile their inherited hatred with the reality that their ancestors had died for a lie. James Samuel Hatfield, great-great-grandson of the original Samuel, captured the community's anguish in a letter to the Louisville Courier-Journal. My family spent 4 generations believing we were avenging the murder of innocents. We named our children after martyrs who never existed. We taught our sons to hate Mackenzies who were just as innocent as we were. How do you apologize to the dead for hating them without cause? The Mackenzie descendants faced an equally complex reckoning. For over a century, they'd honored their ancestors as victims of Hatfield aggression, never knowing that the original massacre had been the work of a slave seeking justice for her brother's sale. Their martyrs had indeed died innocently, but not at the hands of their supposed enemies. Perhaps most poignant were the reactions of the few surviving eyewitnesses to the feud's later violence. 91-year-old Rebecca Mackenzie Caldwell, whose father had died in an 1883 ambush, told reporters, "I spent my whole life visiting Daddy's grave on the anniversary of the poison feast, promising him his death would be avenged. Now I find out he died for a lie that a slave girl never meant to tell. The worst part is, I can't even be angry at her. If someone sold my brother to pay gambling debts, I might have done the same thing." The story of Evelyn's oleander became a cautionary tale, studied in universities across the country, a perfect example of how individual acts of desperation could metastasize into generational trauma when filtered through the lens of prejudice and assumption. Sociology professors used the Clay County feud to illustrate how communities could construct elaborate mythologies around kernel truths, building entire belief systems on foundations of sand. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Evelyn came from an unexpected source. In 1968, the newly formed Clay County Historical Society erected a simple marker at the site of the former Mackenzie cabin. The inscription read, "In memory of Evelyn, whose name we do not know, whose story we failed to tell, and whose desperate act of love for a lost brother became the seed of a century's hatred. May her example remind us that every act of violence, no matter how justified it seems, carries the potential for consequences beyond our imagination or control." The marker stands there still, weathered by 50-plus years of mountain storms, but still legible to those who seek it out. Visitors often leave wildflowers, never oleander, which grows abundantly in those hills, but gentler blooms that speak to forgiveness rather than revenge. Evelyn's story reminds us that history's greatest tragedies often begin with individual choices made in moments of desperate pain. A slave girl's decision to poison her master's stew became the foundation myth for America's deadliest family feud, claiming 137 lives over 4 decades, all because the survivors needed someone to blame for an inexplicable tragedy. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any story isn't the one who commits the original crime, but the one who decides what that crime means to everyone else. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.